The warm glow of candlelight flickered across the pristine white tablecloth as Dr. Eleanor Carter lifted her glass of Barolo, the deep red swirling elegantly in the dim light. The anniversary dinner at Il Sorriso, one of New York's most prestigious Italian restaurants, was meant to be perfect, a celebration of 15 years of marriage. She had spent months planning this evening, ensuring every detail was flawless. A reservation at their corner table, Daniel's favorite branzino alla griglia on the menu, and even the vintage wine he preferred. But instead of a romantic evening, Eleanor found herself watching the carefully orchestrated world she had built crumble before her eyes. A hush fell over the restaurant as Sophie Langford made her entrance, her designer maternity dress clinging to her obviously pregnant form. She stood at the edge of their table, one manicured hand resting possessively on her swollen belly, the other clinging to Daniel's sleeve. She beamed, her smile bright and victorious, as if she had just won a prize instead of making a fatal mistake. "Surprise, honey," Sophie chirped, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "I thought you should hear it from me first." The words sliced through the air like a scalpel, clean and merciless. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, the quiet clinking of silverware against porcelain suddenly non-existent. Daniel Carter, one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, sat frozen, his grip tightening around the stem of his glass. His face was pale, his usually confident blue eyes flickering with unease. Eleanor stared at them, her expression giving nothing away, though inside, something cold and ruthless had settled in her chest. 15 years of marriage, countless nights spent supporting his career, sacrifices made in the name of love and partnership, all reduced to a public spectacle. And yet she was not surprised. She had been waiting for this moment. For months she had watched the signs, seen the subtle changes, the late-night meetings, the sudden expenses, the careful way Daniel had started locking his phone. She had hired a private investigator before she ever confronted him, piecing together the truth layer by layer. And what she had discovered had gone far beyond infidelity. Eleanor took a slow sip of wine, letting the rich taste coat her tongue as she observed the awkward silence stretching between them. She placed the glass down with delicate precision before finally speaking. "Please sit down, Sophie." Daniel flinched at the calm in her voice. He knew her too well to think this would end quietly. The maitre d', ever the professional, quickly brought an extra chair, placing it next to Daniel. Sophie sank into it eagerly, misinterpreting Eleanor's invitation as acceptance rather than the opening move of a game she didn't even realize she was playing. Up close, Eleanor took in every calculated detail of Sophie's appearance, the fresh highlights in her chestnut brown hair, the flawless makeup, the sapphire pendant glinting at her throat. Eleanor's sapphire pendant. A flicker of dark amusement touched Eleanor's lips. So this was where the missing necklace had gone. Daniel cleared his throat, finally regaining his voice. "Eleanor, I can explain." She lifted a hand, silencing him effortlessly. The same gesture she had used on anxious patients before a high-risk surgery. Calm. Controlled. Absolute. "There's no need," she said lightly, lifting her glass again. "After all, Sophie has gone through so much effort to make tonight memorable. Let's hear her out." Daniel tensed, his grip tightening on the tablecloth, but Sophie took the bait. "We're in love," Sophie announced, reaching for Daniel's hand. He didn't take it. "We didn't mean for this to happen, but—" She glanced at Eleanor, feigning pity. "It's time Daniel stops living a lie. This baby is his, and he deserves to be with the woman he truly loves." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, watching as Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Fear. Not of losing her, fear of what she knew. Interesting. She turned her attention back to Sophie, offering a sympathetic smile. 7 months, you said? Sophie nodded, resting a protective hand on her stomach. Due in January. Eleanor swirled her wine thoughtfully. 7 months ago. That would put the conception right around the time of the hospital's annual charity gala. The night Daniel had given a heartfelt speech on medical ethics and patient care. How poetic. Fascinating, Eleanor murmured. Sophie frowned slightly, sensing something was off. Daniel shifted beside her, his discomfort growing with every second. Rebecca, he started again, but Eleanor ignored him. She reached for her purse, pulling out a sleek black envelope and placing it gently on the crisp white tablecloth. Since we're all sharing surprises tonight, she said smoothly, I have a few of my own. Daniel stilled, his knuckles white as his wine glass hovered midair. Sophie's triumphant expression flickered for the first time. The maitre d' appeared at Eleanor's shoulder, another envelope in hand, presented with an imperceptible nod. Right on schedule. Eleanor accepted it with a small smile, setting it beside the first. She let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, watching Daniel's carefully constructed world begin to splinter. Now, she said, unfolding the first envelope with deliberate slowness, shall we begin? Sophie Langford walked into Il Sorriso with the confidence of someone who believed she had won. She thought she was delivering the final, devastating blow to Eleanor Carter, revealing her pregnancy in a way that would humiliate and crush the wife of the man she had stolen. She imagined Daniel choosing her over Eleanor, affirming their love in front of an audience, sealing the fate of his marriage with a grand public declaration. But what Sophie did not realize was that she had not walked into a romantic dinner. She had walked into a carefully constructed trap, one that had been set long before she ever became part of the story. Eleanor Carter remained composed as she placed a sleek black envelope on the table, her hand steady and her expression unreadable. She caught Daniel's gaze, watching the subtle but telling shift in his demeanor, the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers twitched slightly as they hovered over the stem of his wine glass. He knew this moment would come, even if he had never imagined it unfolding so publicly. Sophie's confidence faltered slightly as she glanced at the envelope. The silence that stretched between them made her shift in her seat, the weight of uncertainty settling on her shoulders. Up until now, she had been in control, or so she had believed. The flicker of hesitation in Daniel's eyes, however, suggested something else, something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Eleanor tapped the screen of the sleek black tablet that the maitre d' had discreetly placed beside her. A silent video began to play, a grainy security recording from 7 months ago, the night of the hospital's annual charity gala. The footage revealed a quiet, dimly lit hallway, empty at first. Then Daniel appeared, looking over his shoulder before slipping through a door. A moment later, Sophie followed him inside. The color drained from Sophie's face as recognition dawned. Daniel sat motionless, his expression locked in a cold mask, though Eleanor noted the way his fingers tightened around his glass. The video played for only a few more moments before Eleanor calmly switched off the tablet and set it aside, the damage already done. 7 months, Sophie had said. Due in January. Eleanor had known it, of course. She had calculated the timeline down to the exact night. The irony was almost poetic. While Daniel had stood on stage at the gala, delivering a speech about medical ethics and the importance of integrity in patient care, he had, in reality, been preparing to betray his wife in more ways than one. Eleanor's attention returned to Sophie, who was now staring at her, mouth slightly open, searching for words that would not come. She was beginning to realize that Eleanor was not the oblivious wife she had assumed her to be. She was not a woman caught off guard by an unfaithful husband's indiscretions. She was something else entirely, someone who had been planning, waiting, and orchestrating. Daniel cleared his throat, finally regaining his voice, but Eleanor was already reaching for another envelope, sliding it across the table toward Sophie. This one was heavier, thick with papers, its contents far more damning than the video had been. Sophie hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out the first document. Photographs. screenshots of emails, text messages, all revealing that she was not, in fact, the first. She had not been Daniel's great love or his only secret. Before her there had been others. Lauren Patel, a research assistant who had suddenly transferred to another hospital 3 years ago. Nurse Jessica Turner, whose career had inexplicably unraveled after a quiet, scandal-free departure 5 years prior. The pattern was clear. They had all been discarded, their lives disrupted in the aftermath of their affairs with Daniel. Sophie stared at the papers, her breath uneven as the realization set in. The way she had imagined her relationship with Daniel, special, irreplaceable, had been nothing more than a carefully rehearsed cycle, a pattern of manipulation and deception. She had been following in the footsteps of other women before her, believing the same lies, walking the same path to eventual ruin. Eleanor observed her carefully, noting the way her grip tightened on the stack of documents, the way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak but could not form the words. The betrayal was beginning to set in, but Eleanor was not finished. Without breaking her composed demeanor, she reached for another file, this time placing it in front of Daniel. His eyes flickered toward it, the tension in his body palpable. Unlike Sophie, he already had an idea of what was inside. He did not move to open it, though Eleanor knew he did not have to. He had spent years ensuring certain documents were buried, hidden in places he had assumed no one would look. But Eleanor had looked, and she had found everything. The top document was a death certificate. Martin Reynolds, age 52. Cause of death: surgical complications following an experimental cardiac procedure. Beneath it, another document, his original medical chart, unaltered. The contrast between the two records told a very different story. Martin Reynolds had not been terminal. He had not needed the procedure that had ultimately ended his life. But Daniel had diagnosed him otherwise. He had convinced him, just as he had convinced so many others, that his best chance at survival lay in an experimental treatment. And then, after Reynolds had conveniently passed away, the insurance payout had been processed. Sophie's confusion deepened as she looked between Eleanor and Daniel, her mind trying to catch up to the significance of what she was seeing. She had come here tonight expecting drama, perhaps even a fight. But what she had not expected was evidence of something far worse. Eleanor kept her voice measured as she laid out the next set of files. More patient records, all with similar alterations. Dozens of cases. Patients who had been diagnosed with severe heart conditions that had either not existed or had been significantly exaggerated. Patients who had undergone unnecessary procedures, only to die shortly after, their deaths deemed unfortunate but inevitable. The final piece of evidence Eleanor placed on the table was a USB drive. Inside it was the culmination of her months of investigation. Security footage of Daniel altering patient records, recorded phone calls between him and insurance adjusters, offshore financial transactions that showed the money trail leading directly to him. Sophie pushed her chair back slightly, as if putting distance between herself and the table might also distance her from the truth unfolding in front of her. Eleanor almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Daniel sat motionless, his jaw tight, his body stiff as he finally began to realize the scope of what was happening. His affair had been the least of his crimes, and the woman he had underestimated the most, his wife, had now exposed everything. Then, right on cue, the moment Eleanor had been waiting for arrived. The restaurant doors opened, and two men in dark suits entered. Their movements were deliberate, their eyes scanning the room before settling on Daniel. As they approached the table, they reached for their badges, flashing them discreetly. Dr. Daniel Carter. He was coming with them. Daniel's entire body tensed, his hands clenching at his sides as he turned toward Eleanor, realization dawning with full force. His betrayal, his carefully maintained deception, the empire of wealth and status he had built, it was all crumbling in real time. and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Eleanor picked up her wine glass one final time, swirling the deep red liquid slowly before taking a small deliberate sip. Then she met Daniel's gaze, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to smile. She had spent months planning this night, and it had gone exactly as she intended. The quiet elegance of Il Sorriso was shattered as two FBI agents moved through the restaurant with practiced precision. Every set of eyes in the dining room discreetly followed them, forks pausing midair, hushed whispers passing between tables. The soft melody of the string quartet continued to play, though the tension in the air was undeniable. At that moment, Dr. Daniel Carter, one of the most celebrated cardiothoracic surgeons in New York, was no longer an esteemed physician. He was a man whose carefully built world was about to collapse. He sat frozen in place, his mind working frantically to piece together an escape, but there was no way out. His wife had orchestrated this moment too perfectly. The evidence was damning, irrefutable, and now the authorities were here to take him away. He had spent his entire career exuding confidence, commanding operating rooms, making life-and-death decisions with unwavering authority. Yet now, in the face of Eleanor's silent triumph, he had never looked so small. Sophie Langford remained glued to her seat, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, as if she were struggling to process everything unfolding before her. Only moments ago, she had thought she was revealing a secret that would change Eleanor's life forever. And yet, it was she who now sat trembling, confronted with a truth far worse than she could have imagined. The lead FBI agent, Samuel Price, stepped forward and pulled out a folded document from his jacket. He placed it on the table with deliberate care before glancing between Daniel and Eleanor. His expression remained neutral, though there was no mistaking the undercurrent of certainty in his tone. The warrant for Daniel's arrest sat between them, a final declaration that everything Eleanor had uncovered had been verified, investigated, and deemed legitimate. For a long moment Daniel didn't move. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, too brilliant, too careful to ever be caught. He had worked tirelessly to cover his tracks, ensuring every falsified record, every manipulated insurance payout, and every unnecessary surgery looked like an unfortunate but explainable event. But Eleanor had dug deeper. She had traced the money, the patient records, the hidden offshore accounts. She had unraveled his empire thread by thread, until all that was left was the undeniable truth. Daniel Carter wasn't just an adulterer. He was a murderer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, edged with a desperation that had never been there before. He turned to Eleanor, searching for something in her expression, perhaps a sign of hesitation, of regret, of anything that would suggest she might still care enough to stop what was happening. But she simply sat back in her chair, her hand wrapped loosely around the stem of her wine glass, watching him the way a surgeon observes a patient before making the first incision. The moment stretched, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Then, Agent Price's voice cut through the silence. It was time. Daniel's breath came shallow as the cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The dining room, filled with some of the most powerful and elite figures in New York, had fallen completely silent. The whispers had died down, the spectacle too captivating for even the most seasoned socialites to feign disinterest. Sophie flinched at the sight, her hands pressing protectively against her belly, as if shielding herself from the truth she had refused to see for too long. She had believed she was stepping into a life of luxury, of love, of a secure future beside a man who had promised her everything. Now all of it, every illusion, every whispered promise, was crumbling before her. Eleanor finally stood, smoothing down the fabric of her elegant dress, exuding the quiet authority that had made her such a force in the medical world. Without sparing Daniel another glance, she turned to Agent Price and passed him a second envelope, one she had been holding on to for months. Inside was a detailed breakdown of every patient death, linked to Daniel's experimental procedures. names, dates, insurance payout records. Some of them had been manipulated to make their deaths appear medically justified, but the original charts told a different story. Healthy patients misdiagnosed, experimental treatments that had been unnecessary, fatal complications that had been entirely preventable. Agent Price nodded, slipping the envelope into his briefcase. He had seen the files before. Eleanor had sent them to him weeks ago. This was just the final act, the moment where everything came to a head in a way Daniel had never expected. As the agents guided Daniel toward the exit, he struggled against their grip for the first time. His composure cracked, revealing the fear beneath. He tried one last time, his voice raw and low as he turned back to Eleanor. She simply lifted her wine glass in a silent toast. "Goodbye, Daniel." With that he was gone. The moment the doors shut behind them, the tension in the restaurant shifted. Conversations picked up in hushed, urgent tones, diners exchanging glances as they processed what they had just witnessed. News would travel fast. By morning, the medical world would be rocked by the scandal. Sophie remained seated, looking shaken, her mind reeling from everything she had learned. It was clear now. She had been nothing more than another pawn in Daniel's endless game. Eleanor turned to her, watching as realization settled across Sophie's face. The younger woman had believed she was stealing Daniel away from a cold, distant wife, only to discover she had been used just like the women before her. But unlike them, Sophie now had something that complicated matters further. A child. For the first time that evening, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of genuine contemplation. The baby was innocent. It had no knowledge of the crimes its father had committed, the lives he had taken, the deception that had unraveled tonight. But that did not change the fact that this child would be forever linked to a murderer. Sophie's breath hitched as she finally looked up at Eleanor, her expression desperate, searching for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps condemnation. But Eleanor simply reached for her purse, retrieving another folder. This one contained Sophie's medical records, her previous job at Memorial Hospital in Chicago, the prescription irregularities that had led to her sudden departure, the reason Daniel had been so eager to hire her as his new hospital administrator. Sophie gasped softly, her entire body tensing. Eleanor's voice remained even, almost gentle as she placed the folder in front of her. Daniel had chosen her for a reason, not because he loved her, but because she was convenient, because she had secrets of her own. But now she had a choice to make. With Daniel gone, Sophie's future was uncertain. The authorities would undoubtedly investigate everyone linked to him, including her. She was dangerously close to becoming an accomplice to his crimes, unless she cooperated. Eleanor knew the moment Sophie realized it. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the folder, her mind already racing through the implications. There was still a way out for her, but it would come at a cost. Eleanor leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough for only Sophie to hear. It was time to decide. Would she continue to cling to the sinking wreckage of Daniel Carter's lies? Or would she save herself and her child by telling the truth? The moment stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then slowly Sophie nodded. The game had changed. Eleanor watched as Sophie clutched the folder tightly, her expression hardening into something resolute. She would testify. She would tell the authorities everything she knew about Daniel's activities, the offshore accounts, the late-night meetings, the whispered conversations. And in return, she would be given immunity. Eleanor stood, adjusting her coat as she signaled the maitre d' for the check. There was nothing more to say. The night had played out exactly as she had intended. Tomorrow, the news would break across every major outlet. The brilliant Dr. Daniel Carter, arrested for medical fraud in patient deaths. The scandal that would destroy his legacy forever. And Eleanor? She would watch it all unfold from the sidelines, knowing that the man who had once believed he could manipulate and control everything had finally, irreversibly lost. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she allowed herself one final glance at the restaurant, its golden light still flickering warmly against the dark city skyline. Tonight had not been the end. It was only the beginning. The night Daniel Carter was arrested, the news spread faster than wildfire. By the time Eleanor Carter stepped out of Il Sorriso, reporters were already gathering outside the restaurant, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions. She walked past them without a word, slipping into the back seat of a waiting car. The city lights blurred through the tinted windows, but Eleanor's thoughts were sharp, focused. The night had gone exactly as planned. By morning, Daniel's face was plastered across every major news outlet. Prominent New York cardiothoracic surgeon arrested in patient death scandal. Medical titan falls from grace. Dr. Daniel Carter accused of insurance fraud and malpractice leading to multiple deaths. The headlines varied, but the message was clear. His once untouchable reputation was in ruins. The hospital board had convened an emergency meeting before sunrise. By the time Eleanor arrived, the conference room was packed with administrators, doctors, and legal representatives, their expressions tense. She took her seat at the head of the table, her presence commanding even in the face of chaos. The chairman of the board, Dr. Franklin DeWitt, leaned forward, his hands clasped together. He had spent decades at New York General, overseeing some of the most high-profile medical advancements in the country. Now, his hospital was at the center of one of the biggest medical scandals in history. He wasted no time. The moment Eleanor settled in her seat, the questions began. How long had she known? How deep did the corruption run? How many patients had been affected? Eleanor answered each one with precision. She laid out the financial records, the falsified medical charts, the insurance payouts, everything she had gathered over the past year. She described Daniel's methods in chilling detail, how he had diagnosed healthy patients with life-threatening conditions, convinced them to undergo experimental procedures, and then ensured their deaths appeared as tragic medical failures. The silence in the room was heavy. Some of the board members looked horrified, others furious. Several paled as they realized just how much they had overlooked. Dr. DeWitt exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "This isn't just malpractice," he finally said. This is murder." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, and every single person who ignored the warning signs, who helped cover up the financial discrepancies, who turned a blind eye to the growing mortality rate in Daniel's department, they will be held accountable." The legal team confirmed that Daniel's medical license had been revoked effective immediately. Every patient file he had touched would be re-examined, and his department was already being dismantled, its funding frozen pending further investigation. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She slid another folder across the table. "This," she said, "is a proposed Patient Protection Act, a reform that will ensure this never happens again." The board members looked through the documents, their expressions shifting as they read. The proposed policies would increase oversight on experimental procedures, require multiple independent reviews before high-risk surgeries, and create stricter regulations for medical insurance payouts. "This is bigger than just Daniel," Eleanor continued. "If he could get away with this for years, how many others have done the same? How many hospitals have ignored red flags because a surgeon was too profitable to question?" She saw the moment the realization hit them. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. This was about saving lives. By the time the meeting ended, the hospital had committed to implementing immediate policy changes. The Carter Patient Protection Act would be reviewed by legal teams and pushed forward for legislative backing. Eleanor left the hospital knowing she had done what she came to do, but there was still more to be done. Over the next few weeks, the investigation into Daniel's crimes expanded beyond anything anyone had anticipated. The FBI uncovered hidden offshore accounts, tracking millions in insurance fraud payouts funneled through dummy corporations. More doctors and hospital administrators were implicated. Some who had directly helped cover up Daniel's crimes, others who had simply looked the other way. Former patients' families came forward, some grieving loved ones they had believed had died of natural causes, only to discover their deaths had been orchestrated for profit. Others shared their stories of being pressured into unnecessary procedures, barely escaping with their lives. The scandal sent shockwaves through the medical community. The New York Medical Licensing Board conducted an internal audit, leading to the suspension of multiple doctors, administrators, and insurance executives who had either aided Daniel or ignored the warning signs. Sophie Langford, once Daniel's confident mistress, disappeared from the public eye. Under witness protection, she provided testimony that was crucial to the prosecution. She handed over financial records, emails, and details of private meetings Daniel had never expected her to remember. In exchange, she was granted immunity. Her testimony confirmed one final, shocking detail. Daniel had planned to flee the country. Before his arrest, he had been preparing to leave the U.S., transfer his funds, and start over in Europe under a new name. If Eleanor had waited even a few weeks longer, he might have vanished completely. The trial. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Victims' families occupied the front rows, many clutching photographs of their lost loved ones. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, eager to document the downfall of a once-respected surgeon. Daniel sat in his prison-issued suit, his once impeccable appearance replaced by exhaustion and the weight of his crumbling world. Eleanor took the stand as the final witness. She detailed his crimes, his lies, his manipulations. She spoke of the patients who should have survived, the lives that had been cut short, the families who had been deceived. She presented the documents, the medical records, the financial transactions, every piece of evidence that sealed his fate. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell into silence. Guilty. On all counts. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. A collective breath of relief swept through the room. The families of the victims embraced, tears streaming down their faces, justice finally within their grasp. Daniel Carter had spent his career playing God, deciding who lived and who died. Now he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, powerless. 5 years later, Eleanor stood on the steps of the newly renamed Carter-Dawson Medical Ethics Center, a research institute dedicated to patient advocacy and medical integrity. It had been established in memory of Daniel's victims, ensuring that no doctor would ever again be able to exploit their patients the way he had. The Carter Patient Protection Act had been passed into law, becoming one of the most significant healthcare reforms in decades. Hospitals across the country had implemented stricter regulations, audits, and oversight policies to prevent medical fraud. Eleanor had spent years traveling, speaking, and testifying, using her experience to shape the future of ethical medical practices. She had turned tragedy into change, ensuring that what happened with Daniel would never happen again. As she stepped forward to cut the ribbon at the center's grand opening, she felt a sense of closure, not just for herself, but for every patient, every family, and every life that had been affected by Daniel's greed. In the end, Daniel had thought he could control everything. He had believed himself to be invincible, untouchable, but he had underestimated the one person he never should have, his wife. Eleanor had not just exposed him, she had dismantled everything he had built, and she had rebuilt something stronger in its place. As she looked out at the crowd, the families, the survivors, and the future medical students who would learn from the mistakes of the past, she knew one thing for certain. Daniel Carter's name would not be remembered as a brilliant surgeon. It would be remembered as a cautionary tale. The trial had ended, and Daniel Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom had erupted in gasps, quiet sobs, and sighs of relief, as justice was finally served. Yet, for Eleanor Carter, the work was far from over. Exposing Daniel's crimes had been just the beginning. What came next was the long road of rebuilding the broken system he had exploited, ensuring that no one else would ever suffer at the hands of another corrupt doctor. In the weeks following the trial, the medical community underwent a reckoning. Every hospital Daniel had been affiliated with launched internal investigations into their practices. Boards of directors, insurance companies, and state medical associations scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Hospital executives were forced to explain how a serial murderer in a white coat had operated undetected for years. More arrests followed. Doctors, administrators, and insurance agents who had helped facilitate Daniel's fraud were indicted. Some had knowingly enabled him, blinded by profit. Others had turned a blind eye, too afraid to question a powerful surgeon. But no one was safe from the fallout. Eleanor had testified before the New York Medical Licensing Board, ensuring that every accomplice who had played a role in Daniel's crimes lost their medical license permanently. One by one, the people who had protected Daniel were stripped of their positions, their reputations in tatters. But Eleanor wanted more than just individual punishment. She wanted systemic change. The Carter Patient Protection Act, the very reform she had proposed in the hospital boardroom, had gained national attention. Senators, patient advocacy groups, and ethics committees had rallied behind it, recognizing the urgent need for change. The legislation introduced mandatory independent oversight for high-risk medical procedures, strict financial auditing for experimental treatments, and criminal penalties for doctors who manipulated patient outcomes for profit. It took months of lobbying, hearings, and testimonies from grieving families, but the law was eventually passed. Eleanor had stood at the signing ceremony in Washington, D.C., surrounded by survivors and loved ones of Daniel's victims. The president had shaken her hand, thanking her for her role in exposing one of the worst medical fraud scandals in history. The law now bore her husband's name, not as a mark of honor, but as a permanent warning. Daniel Carter's legacy was no longer one of brilliance or innovation, but one of deception and death. 5 years had passed since Daniel's arrest, and Eleanor stood outside the newly inaugurated Carter-Dawson Medical Ethics Center, named in honor of two of Daniel's earliest known victims. It had been built as a beacon of accountability, dedicated to researching medical fraud prevention, patient advocacy, and ethical healthcare policies. Inside, young medical students and researchers filled the halls, studying how corruption infiltrated medicine and learning how to detect and prevent it. It was everything Eleanor had wanted, a way to ensure that Daniel's crimes had not been in vain. As she walked through the center, she stopped in front of a wall of names, each one belonging to a patient who had died under Daniel's care. It was a solemn tribute, a reminder of the lives that had been stolen. She ran her fingers over the name Claire Dawson, the young woman who had unknowingly ignited Eleanor's investigation when she had questioned the sudden death of her father. Claire had stood beside Eleanor through every step of the trial, refusing to let her mother's death be forgotten. Now, Claire was a patient rights advocate, traveling across the country to ensure families knew their rights when dealing with the medical system. The tragedy that had taken her father had shaped her future, just as it had shaped Eleanor's. Far from the chaos of New York, Sophie Langford had started over. After Daniel's arrest, she had gone into witness protection, her testimony critical in securing multiple convictions. She had been granted immunity in exchange for full cooperation, and when the trial was over, she had taken her newborn daughter and disappeared into a new life. Eleanor had received only one update from her since then, a single letter, postmarked from somewhere in the Midwest. The letter had been brief but heartfelt. Sophie had thanked Eleanor for forcing her to see the truth, for saving her and her child from a dark and dangerous future. Her daughter, Lena, was healthy, safe, and growing up far away from the shadow of her father's crimes. Eleanor had burned the letter after reading it, ensuring no one would ever trace Sophie's whereabouts. She did not hate her, not anymore. The young woman had been a fool, yes, but not a monster. In the end, she had done the right thing, and for that, Eleanor had let her go. In the depths of a maximum security federal prison, Daniel Carter had faded into irrelevance. Once a man of prestige, now he was just another inmate. Stripped of his designer suits, his luxury lifestyle, and his surgical brilliance, he had nothing left. No one visited him. No letters came. His former colleagues refused to speak his name. His medical achievements were erased from journals, his awards rescinded. Even his own child would never know him. Every now and then, a journalist would request an interview, hoping to extract some grand confession, but Daniel never spoke. He knew, just as Eleanor had known from the start, that his story was no longer his own. He had spent his life playing God. Now he was nothing. As Eleanor left the Carter-Dawson Medical Ethics Center, she took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. She had survived. More than that, she had won. Daniel had believed that his affair, his betrayal, would ruin her, that it would leave her powerless, broken, humiliated. Instead, he was the one who had been destroyed. His career, his reputation, his future, all gone. And Eleanor had built something greater in its place. As she walked to her car, she pulled out her phone. A news alert flashed across the screen. An article discussing the decline in medical fraud cases since the implementation of the Carter Patient Protection Act. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself a genuine smile. Daniel had tried to rewrite their story at that anniversary dinner years ago, believing he would humiliate and discard her. But it had been his own undoing. And Eleanor had ensured that his name, his crimes, and his legacy would never be forgotten. Not as a surgeon, not as a healer, but as a cautionary tale. The world had moved on from Daniel Carter's scandal, but his name still lingered in whispers. A cautionary tale told in medical schools, a case study in ethics seminars, a grim reminder of what happened when power, greed, and unchecked arrogance were allowed to fester within the walls of medicine. Eleanor Carter, however, had not just moved on. She had rebuilt. Years had passed since the trial, and she had dedicated herself to reforming the system Daniel had exploited. With the passage of the Carter Patient Protection Act, hospitals across the country had implemented stricter oversight measures. New regulations ensured that no single doctor, no matter how brilliant or influential, could operate without accountability. Eleanor had spent those years traveling, speaking at medical conferences, testifying before legislative committees, and consulting on hospital ethics policies. She became a voice of change, a woman who had turned personal betrayal into professional revolution. And now, as she stood in the grand opening ceremony of the Carter-Dawson Medical Ethics Center, she knew she had accomplished what she had set out to do. The building, a state-of-the-art research facility, was dedicated to investigating and preventing medical fraud. Inside, doctors, students, and researchers were being trained to detect ethical violations, ensuring that no other surgeon could ever replicate what Daniel had done. The center stood as both a tribute and a warning, honoring the victims of Daniel's crimes while ensuring that their deaths had led to something greater. Among the attendees of the ceremony were those who had been personally affected by Daniel's crimes. Claire Dawson, now a well-known patient rights advocate, had flown in from Washington, D.C. to give a speech. She had spent the years since her father's death fighting for stricter medical oversight laws, ensuring that families had access to independent medical reviews before making critical decisions about their care. She had been just a grieving daughter when she first met Eleanor, desperate for answers. Now she was a force of her own, channeling her loss into systemic change. Sarah Chan, the widow of one of Daniel's former patients, had helped establish a foundation in her husband's name, providing financial assistance to families pursuing medical malpractice lawsuits. She had worked tirelessly to connect victims with legal resources, ensuring that hospitals could no longer intimidate or silence grieving families. Even former hospital staff who had once admired Daniel blindly had begun to speak out, acknowledging the toxic culture of hero worship that had allowed him to thrive unchecked. They had learned the hard way that reputation alone should never be enough to protect a man from scrutiny. These were the people who had suffered because of Daniel Carter, but they had refused to let his crimes define them. Like Eleanor, they had chosen to fight back. Not with revenge, but with reform. Inside the center, a memorial wall stood at the entrance. A sleek, polished stone surface engraved with the names of Daniel's victims. Each one was a reminder of what had been lost, a testament to the lives that should have never been cut short. Eleanor ran her fingers over the etchings, pausing at the name Jennifer Adams, a young mother who had trusted Daniel with her life, believing his false diagnosis, only to be pushed into an unnecessary surgery that ended in her death. There had been 47 confirmed deaths directly linked to Daniel's fraudulent practices. But Eleanor knew the real number would likely never be known. Still, those 47 names would remain here immortalized. Their stories would never be erased. Daniel had wanted his name to be remembered for his achievements. Instead, it had been carved into history for his atrocities. The one person missing from the ceremony was Sophie Langford. After the trial, she had vanished into witness protection, taking her newborn daughter with her. She had left behind the world she had once fought so hard to be a part of, realizing too late that she had never truly belonged there. Eleanor had received only one letter from her since then. In it, Sophie had thanked Eleanor for showing her the truth, even though it had come at a devastating cost. She had spoken of her daughter, Lena, now growing up in a world where she would never know her father's crimes. She had written of starting fresh, of finally learning what it meant to live without chasing after the approval of men like Daniel. Eleanor had read the letter once, then burned it, letting the ashes scatter in the wind. Sophie had been young, naive, and foolish, but she had ultimately made the right choice. And for that, Eleanor had let her go. In a maximum security prison, Daniel Carter had become just another inmate. Stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his power, he was no longer the brilliant surgeon he had once been. No medical journals cited his work anymore. No students studied his techniques. His name had been erased from every respectable institution that had once celebrated him. There were no visitors, no letters, no appeals left to file. He had been sentenced to multiple life terms, ensuring that he would never walk free again. Eleanor never thought about him anymore. Not really. He had already faded from her life the moment those handcuffs had closed around his wrists. The only time she heard his name now was when people discussed medical history, his case studied alongside other notorious cases of medical malpractice and fraud. His name would never be celebrated, only remembered as a warning. As the ceremony ended, Eleanor stepped outside the Carter-Dawson Medical Ethics Center, taking in the cool evening air. She had survived. More than that, she had won. Daniel had believed that betraying her would destroy her. He had thought that revealing his affair, flaunting his mistress, would leave her powerless, broken, and humiliated. Instead, he had been the one who lost everything. His career, his future, his freedom, all gone. And Eleanor had rebuilt something greater in his absence. She had taken the wreckage of their marriage and forged something powerful from it. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed with a news alert. An article discussing the sharp decline in medical fraud cases since the Carter Patient Protection Act had been enacted. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to smile. Daniel had tried to write the ending of their story, believing he would humiliate and discard her. But instead it had been his own undoing, and Eleanor had ensured that his name, his crimes, and his legacy would never be forgotten. Not as a pioneering surgeon, not as a medical genius, but as a cautionary tale. The years following Daniel Carter's downfall had been marked by transformation, not just for Eleanor Carter, but for the entire medical community. His crimes had exposed weaknesses in the system, revealing the horrifying ease with which a surgeon could manipulate, deceive, and kill under the guise of innovation. But Eleanor had ensured that his legacy would not be one of brilliance, but of warning. The Carter Patient Protection Act had become a landmark law, reshaping the way hospitals handled experimental treatments, insurance policies, and surgical oversight. Medical fraud cases had declined dramatically, and doctors who once operated unchecked were now under constant scrutiny. Eleanor had spent years in boardrooms, courtrooms, and lecture halls, advocating for stronger policies and more ethical leadership in medicine. Her efforts had led to the establishment of national databases tracking unusual medical mortality rates, making it nearly impossible for another Daniel Carter to slip through the cracks. She had turned tragedy into transformation, and now, standing before a crowd of medical professionals, legislators, and victims' families, she was about to close the final chapter. The ceremony was held at the Carter-Dawson Medical Ethics Center, the institution that had grown from the ashes of Daniel's crimes. What had once been a dream of justice had now become a global leader in medical ethics and fraud prevention. Eleanor stood at the podium, looking out over the audience. In the front row, Claire Dawson, the daughter of one of Daniel's earliest victims, sat with a quiet strength that had taken years to build. Once a grieving daughter desperate for answers, Claire was now a leader in patient advocacy, ensuring that families had the knowledge and power to protect themselves from medical exploitation. Beside her sat Sarah Chan, who had spent the last few years working with hospitals to improve whistleblower protections, ensuring that doctors who suspected corruption could speak out without fear of retaliation. These were the faces of change, the people who had turned loss into action. As Eleanor stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. 5 years ago, she began, her voice steady, a man I once trusted, a man the world trusted, was exposed for what he truly was. Not a healer, not a pioneer, but a man who used medicine as a weapon, who turned patients into commodities and their deaths into paychecks. A murmur spread through the room. They had all seen the case unfold, but hearing it spoken so plainly still carried a weight that could not be ignored. But today, she continued, we do not gather here to remember him. We gather to remember the people he hurt, the patients who were lied to, who were given diagnoses that were meant to break them, who were convinced to undergo treatments that would ultimately kill them. She glanced at the memorial wall, where the names of Daniel's victims were engraved. Each one was a life stolen, a future erased. But today they were more than just names. They are the reason we stand here today. Because of them, laws have changed. Hospitals have changed. The way we protect patients has changed. And because of them, we will never let it happen again. The crowd rose in applause, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. A sense of finality, of closure. Far from the world he once dominated, Daniel Carter had been forgotten. No longer the celebrated surgeon, no longer the man who commanded respect in operating rooms and board meetings, he now spent his days behind bars, stripped of his influence, his wealth, and his name. There had been no appeals, no retrials, no second chances. His crimes were too extensive, too deliberate, too horrifying for any judge to consider leniency. He was, in every way that mattered, erased. In prison, he was just another number, living a life of repetition and obscurity. The man who had once decided the fate of others now had every moment of his life decided for him. Eleanor never visited. She never wrote. To her, he had ceased to exist the moment he had been led out of Il Sorriso in handcuffs. The world had moved on without him, and in the years that followed, his name became nothing more than a warning, a lesson taught to every medical student on the dangers of unchecked power. The last time Eleanor had heard from Sophie Langford, it had been through a single, carefully worded letter. After the trial, Sophie had disappeared into witness protection, taking her newborn daughter and starting a life far away from Daniel's crimes. She had traded the wealth and luxury she had once chased for anonymity and safety. The letter had been brief. She had thanked Eleanor for forcing her to see the truth, for saving her from a future built on lies and deception. She had written of Lena, the daughter who would never know her father, who would never have to carry the weight of his sins. Sophie had promised to raise her far from the shadows of her past, to teach her the importance of truth, strength, and self-worth. Eleanor had read the letter once, then burned it, ensuring there would be no trace of Sophie's whereabouts. Whatever life Sophie had built for herself, Eleanor hoped it was a good one. She had made mistakes, but in the end she had done the right thing. And that was enough. As the sun set over the Carter-Dawson Medical Ethics Center, Eleanor took a final walk through its halls, passing the lecture rooms, the research labs, and the offices filled with people dedicated to protecting patients. She had built something lasting, something meaningful, out of the wreckage Daniel had left behind. His betrayal had not destroyed her. His crimes had not broken her. Instead, they had forged her into something stronger. Daniel had believed that bringing his mistress to their anniversary dinner would humiliate Eleanor, would shatter her and make her crawl away in disgrace. Instead, it had been his undoing. She had dismantled his empire, his career, his freedom, and in its place, she had built a legacy of integrity and justice. She had ensured that his name would never be celebrated, only remembered as a warning. Eleanor Carter had won, and Daniel Carter had lost, not just his freedom but his place in history. He had tried to write the final chapter of their story that night at Il Sorriso, but in the end it had been Eleanor who wrote it, and she had made sure it was a story worth telling. Daniel Carter was never a man who acted on impulse. His mind was surgical in its precision, every action a calculated step toward an end goal. Now that he was free, his objective was not just revenge, it was complete psychological destruction. He had no intention of simply killing Eleanor. That would be too easy, too quick. No, he wanted to unravel her, to dismantle the life she had built from the ruins of his downfall. Eleanor Carter had taken everything from him. His career, his reputation, his freedom. She had exposed his work, his carefully hidden crimes, and ensured that he would be locked away for life. But Daniel had never intended to remain caged forever. His mind had never stopped working, even behind bars. He had spent years learning her new patterns, using his contacts to track her rise as a national figure in medical ethics reform. He had followed the changes in legislation that bore his name like a scar. The Carter Patient Protection Act, a law ensuring that no other doctor could manipulate medicine the way he had. He had watched as she became stronger, more influential, more powerful than she had ever been when they were married. And that was why she needed to be broken. It began subtly, just enough for Eleanor to question whether it was real. A faint shift in her environment, the feeling of being watched, small things moved out of place. The first time she noticed, it was in her home office. A pen that had been sitting on the right side of her desk was now on the left. It was a detail no one else would have caught, but Eleanor had spent years training herself to be hyper-aware of her surroundings. She dismissed it at first. Exhaustion, stress, paranoia. After all, she had barely slept since the news of Daniel's escape. But then other things began to happen. One night, she entered her walk-in closet and found that her shoes had been rearranged. A pair of red heels, ones Daniel had bought for her years ago, had been placed perfectly at the front, as if waiting for her. The alarm system had been active. The security cameras showed nothing. But she knew. Daniel had been inside. The first real message arrived a few days later. A single envelope, left on the doorstep. Inside was a wedding photo, one of their favorites. They had taken it at a vineyard in Italy, just before their anniversary dinner, years before everything unraveled. But it had been altered. Her face was scratched out, deep grooves cut into the glossy surface where her eyes and smile had once been. But Daniel's remained untouched. his expression still one of confident arrogance. At the bottom, a note was scrawled in his unmistakable handwriting. "You should have left me for dead." Eleanor felt a slow, measured breath leave her lungs. She had known this moment would come. She had been preparing for it. But something deep inside her twisted in unease. Daniel wasn't acting out of blind rage. He was playing a game, and he was letting her know that he had all the time in the world. Eleanor hadn't told anyone about the pregnancy yet. Not even Agent Price, not even her closest allies. She was still processing it, still deciding what this meant, what she was willing to do to protect the life growing inside her. Which is why the next package nearly made her heart stop. It was a small, neatly wrapped box tied with a silk ribbon, the kind Daniel used to buy her gifts in during their early years of marriage. Inside, nestled in white tissue paper, was a tiny baby onesie. It was ivory-colored, soft, completely new, except for the single red stain at the collar. Eleanor didn't need to touch it to know what it was supposed to symbolize. The accompanying note was short. A father should know his child. Her fingers tightened around the paper, her pulse thundering in her ears. He knew. And if he knew, that meant he had been watching her more closely than she had realized. Eleanor wasn't an easy target. She had security, she had training, she had resources. But Daniel was unpredictable. And that was the most dangerous part of him. She doubled her security protocols, replaced her entire security team, and installed biometric locks in her home. But none of it mattered. Because Daniel wasn't attacking her home. He was attacking her sanity. One evening, Eleanor was leaving her office building. Her mind still clouded with thoughts of her pregnancy and Daniel's latest message. As she stepped into the elevator, she smelled it. His cologne. The same one he had worn for years. Expensive, understated, unmistakable. Her breath hitched, her muscles tensing. Was he here? Was he in the building? But when she turned, the elevator was empty. A slow realization crept over her. He had planted it there. Not a direct confrontation, but just enough to rattle her. Just enough to make her wonder if he was standing just beyond the shadows. Eleanor wasn't the kind of woman to crumble under fear. If Daniel thought he could push her into panic, he had underestimated her. She began counter-surveillance, tracing his movements, trying to predict where he would strike next. But he had become a ghost, leaving no traceable evidence. And then one night, she woke up to the sound of her bedroom window clicking open. Her heart pounded as she reached for the gun she kept in the nightstand, the cold steel grounding her. She moved silently, every muscle in her body tense as she scanned the room. But the window was still locked. The alarm hadn't been triggered. But on her pillow sat a single white rose. A flower Daniel had always given her after surgeries, a quiet symbol of triumph. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, her grip crushing the delicate petals. He was close. Daniel wasn't just terrorizing Eleanor. He was unraveling their past, twisting every memory into a threat. He left reminders of their marriage in places he knew would unnerve her, or a silver bracelet she had lost years ago, suddenly appearing on her bathroom counter, their wedding song playing on her car radio, despite the station being turned off, or a framed photo of them placed on her nightstand, identical to the one she had thrown away years ago. Every action had a purpose. He wasn't just stalking her. He was rewriting their history, turning their love into a nightmare. Eleanor knew one thing for certain. Daniel wouldn't stop until he had completely destroyed her, and she refused to let that happen. She had played defense long enough. Now it was time to go on the offensive. She gathered her team, FBI contacts, security experts, cyber analysts. She wasn't just going to wait for Daniel to strike. She was going to hunt him first. But deep inside, a new fear gnawed at her. This wasn't just about her anymore. She had a child to protect. And she knew Daniel would never let that child exist without him. Eleanor Carter had built a life out of ruins. 5 years ago, her name had been entwined with scandal, A woman betrayed by her husband. A wife who had unknowingly shared a home with a murderer. But today, Eleanor Carter was no one's victim. She had become one of the most influential figures in medical ethics reform, an unwavering force in the fight against fraud, corruption, and abuse in the healthcare industry. Her name was synonymous with justice, a symbol of accountability in a system that had once failed so many. The Carter Patient Protection Act had changed the way hospitals operated across the country. It had led to dozens of new investigations, uncovering fraud schemes that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. The legislation had introduced mandatory independent oversight for experimental treatments, stricter insurance auditing, and increased protections for whistleblowers, ensuring that no one could manipulate the system the way Daniel had. She had testified before Congress, worked alongside some of the leading minds in medical law, and had even been featured on the covers of major publications as the woman who had brought down one of the most notorious medical criminals in history. Yet, despite all of her victories, she still couldn't shake the shadow of Daniel Carter. Eleanor lived in a high-end Manhattan brownstone, a fortress of steel and glass, surrounded by state-of-the-art security systems, motion detectors, facial recognition locks, a 24/7 surveillance team. Everything was designed to ensure that no one could get near her without her knowing. But old habits of fear lingered. She still checked her door locks 3 times before bed. She still memorized license plates of cars she saw more than once near her home. And she still carried a weapon everywhere she went, just in case. Daniel had been gone for 5 years, locked away in a maximum security prison, his reign of terror over. But Eleanor knew better than to believe in happily ever afters. Monsters like Daniel didn't just disappear. Lately, something had been gnawing at her. An unease that had nothing to do with the constant paranoia she had lived with for years. It was something deeper, something she had refused to acknowledge. The fatigue, the nausea, the way her body had begun to feel different. She knew the signs. She had seen them in countless women before. But she wasn't ready to accept it, not yet. The pregnancy test sat untouched on the bathroom counter, its presence an accusation she wasn't willing to face. She had buried herself in work, in back-to-back meetings, in her relentless pursuit of justice and reform, anything to keep from acknowledging the truth. Because the moment she did, she would have to face the nightmare of what it meant. If she was pregnant, then the child growing inside her was Daniel's. And no matter how much she had fought to erase him from her life, his legacy would live on inside her. She gripped the edge of the marble sink, breathing deeply, forcing herself to steady the storm inside her. She couldn't allow herself to be weak. Not now. Not ever. As if summoned by her thoughts, a knock at the door broke through the silence of her home. She walked toward it with measured steps, her fingers instinctively brushing against the firearm tucked beneath her silk blouse. Opening the door, she found herself face to face with Agent Samuel Price. He had been the lead investigator in Daniel's case, the man who had helped her bring him down. Over the years, they had remained in contact, working together to track down others like Daniel, men who abused power under the guise of medicine. But tonight, his face was grim, his usually composed expression tight with urgency. Her stomach twisted. She had seen that look before. Something was wrong. Agent Price stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he handed her a file. Eleanor took it, her fingers tightening around the edges as she flipped it open. The moment her eyes landed on the first page, her blood turned ice cold. A security report. A timeline of events. Daniel Carter had escaped. Eleanor exhaled, slow and controlled, her body rigid but unreadable. She didn't ask how. She didn't ask when. She only asked one question. Where is he? Price hesitated. We don't know. A chill slid down her spine. Daniel had been waiting, planning, watching, and now he was free. And he was coming for her. Eleanor closed the file, her pulse steady. She had known this day would come. But this time she wasn't the woman she had been before. This time she was ready. The world around Eleanor seemed to shrink as she absorbed the words. Daniel Carter had escaped. Agent Samuel Price stood in the dimly lit foyer of her home, watching her carefully, waiting for a reaction. Most people, upon hearing that a convicted murderer and master manipulator had broken out of a maximum security prison, would have been paralyzed by fear. Eleanor was not most people. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the whisper of old instincts sharpening like a blade. But she did not panic. She did not collapse under the weight of what this meant. Instead, she simply inhaled, slow and controlled, processing the information. "How?" she asked. Price exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Still piecing that together. He had helped, that much we know. The cameras picked up a black sedan waiting outside the perimeter. We suspect an inside job." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Daniel had always had a way of making people do what he wanted. He had spent years manipulating nurses, administrators, patients, even insurance agents. It was no surprise that he had found someone willing to help him slip through the cracks. She turned, walking toward her living room, her mind already moving several steps ahead. Price followed, shutting the door behind him. She picked up the remote control and switched on the television. Within seconds, Daniel's face filled the screen. Breaking news. Convicted killer and former surgeon Daniel Carter escapes federal custody. The footage was grainy, captured from a security camera just outside the prison's east wing. In the flickering image, Daniel was barely more than a shadow, slipping past the fence, his movements precise and effortless. The camera caught the moment he climbed into the waiting car, the taillights disappearing into the night. A ghost reborn. Eleanor turned off the television. "He's coming," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Price studied her, as if searching for fear. He found none. "You should consider leaving the city," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "No." Price sighed. "Eleanor, this isn't the same as before. He's had years to plan this. So have I." Price's expression tightened. He had expected resistance, but not this level of calm certainty. Eleanor walked to her desk, opening a locked drawer. Inside, documents, blueprints, and files lay in neat stacks, her own private research. She hadn't spent the last 5 years waiting to be a victim again. She had prepared. That night, Eleanor barely slept. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the ultrasound scan she had taken only days ago. A tiny, fragile life growing inside her, unknowingly tangled in the nightmare that was Daniel Carter. She hadn't decided what to do yet. But now the choice was no longer hers alone. Daniel would find out, if he hadn't already. And when he did, she knew he wouldn't just want revenge, he would want control. Her fingers tightened around the image. She would not let that happen. The soft hum of her security system filled the silence, its steady rhythm a reassurance that no one could get in without her knowing. But Daniel was not like other threats. Daniel knew her better than anyone, and that made him unpredictable. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Every channel, every newspaper, every social media outlet was covering the escape of Daniel Carter. Former patients, hospital board members, even past acquaintances were interviewed, their faces full of shock and unease. The medical community was shaken, the world forced to remember the horror of what he had done. Eleanor watched it all unfold from the privacy of her home, sipping coffee as though preparing for a war she had long known was inevitable. Then the first sign came. A package left on her doorstep. Her security team had scanned it for threats, clearing it before bringing it inside. But Eleanor already knew what it was. She opened the lid carefully, her stomach tightening at what she found inside. A single scalpel, polished and gleaming. A symbol of what Daniel had once been. A tool he had used to save lives until he had started taking them instead. And beneath it a note. "Did you miss me?" She exhaled slowly, setting the box aside. The game had begun. Eleanor didn't waste time. She made 2 phone calls, the first to Agent Price, the second to her personal security advisor. Within an hour, a team of specialists was stationed at her property, reinforcing the already extensive security measures. But Eleanor wasn't just waiting for Daniel to make his move. She had her own plan. She pulled out a file she had been building for years, one that tracked every person who had visited Daniel in prison, every known contact he had before his arrest, and every financial transaction connected to his name. If Daniel had help escaping, she was going to find out who had orchestrated it. She wasn't the same woman he had left behind. She wasn't a scared wife trying to escape his shadow. She was the one who had brought him down once, and she would do it again. That evening, as Eleanor stepped outside onto her balcony, the city stretched before her. A world that had moved on from Daniel Carter, but he was dragging her back into his darkness. Her fingers traced the scar on her wrist, a mark from the night Daniel had been arrested, the night he had tried to silence her for good. She had survived. She had rebuilt. And now he wanted to take it all away. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She answered, bringing the phone to her ear. For a moment, silence. Then his voice. Smooth. Cold. Familiar. "I hear congratulations are in order," Daniel murmured. Eleanor's breath did not hitch. She did not react. He knew. She tightened her grip on the phone. "You should have stayed buried, Daniel." A low chuckle. "Oh, Eleanor. You should have known I was never going to let you go." The line went dead. Eleanor lowered the phone. She turned back toward the city, her expression unreadable. She had spent years preparing for this exact moment. And now it was here. The hunt had begun. The bathroom was silent, save for the soft hum of the city beyond her window. Eleanor Carter stood motionless, staring at the small plastic stick in her hand. The 2 pink lines were unmistakable. Pregnant. Her fingers tightened around the test as a slow, measured breath left her lips. She had known. Somewhere deep inside, she had already recognized the changes in her body. The fatigue, the nausea, the way her senses had sharpened in an almost primal way. But knowing and accepting were 2 different things. Now there was no more ignoring the truth. Her body had become a battlefield. A war between past and future. Between fear and instinct. She lowered herself onto the edge of her bed, her heart beating slow, steady, too controlled for the storm raging inside her. She had spent 5 years erasing Daniel Carter from her life, destroying his legacy, ensuring that the world remembered him not as a brilliant surgeon, but as a murderer. And yet here he was, inside her, a part of him, undeniable, inescapable. Her free hand instinctively moved to her stomach. She closed her eyes, exhaling through her nose, trying to force logic over emotion. This child was not him. It was not his evil, not his sins. It was hers too. A new breath. Slow. Deliberate. She had survived Daniel before. She would survive this. A sound cut through the silence. Soft. Subtle. Just enough to make her listen. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. Her body tensed, every nerve alert. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't just the weight of the moment making her imagine things. She stood carefully, moving toward the floor-length window that overlooked the street. The curtains were drawn, but she eased them apart just enough to see. Her pulse slowed. There, parked across the street, was a black car. No markings. No lights. Engine still running. Idling. Waiting. Eleanor stayed motionless, watching. She had memorized the cars that belonged to her neighbors. The black sedan was not one of them. She scanned the street, the surrounding buildings, the shadows near the alleyway. Nothing. But she knew. She had felt this before. The quiet before an attack. The ghost of Daniel Carter creeping into her world again. A part of her wanted to move away from the window, to disappear from view, but she didn't. Instead, she stood there, visible, staring back at the car as if daring it to make a move. Minutes passed. Then finally the car pulled away. Slow. Controlled. Like a promise. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to remain still. Composed. Unmoved. Only when the vehicle disappeared down the block did she let the curtain fall back into place. She exhaled, her hand unconsciously returning to her stomach. Her mind was already working, sorting through possibilities. A threat? A message? Or just a test? Had Daniel sent someone to watch her? To see if she had figured it out yet? Or was it him? Her chest tightened. No, Daniel wouldn't be so obvious. He was patient, precise. He wouldn't reveal his presence until he was ready to strike, which meant this was just the beginning. Eleanor turned, crossing the room with measured steps. She didn't hesitate as she opened the drawer of her nightstand. Her hand found the cold steel of the gun inside, a weapon she had trained with, one she never allowed herself to forget how to use. Her grip was steady. She wasn't afraid of Daniel, but this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the child she now carried. A part of her, perhaps the most terrifying part, wondered how much of Daniel would live on in this child. Would their eyes mirror his? Their voice carry the same sharp edge? Would they grow up wondering who their father was? Would she ever tell them? She squeezed the gun tighter, forcing the thoughts away. Now wasn't the time for fears or uncertainties. Now was the time for action. She grabbed her phone, dialing a number without hesitation. Agent Price picked up on the second ring. "You're awake," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. "So are you," she countered. A pause. What happened? She glanced at the window again, at the empty space where the car had been. "I need more eyes on my street," she said simply. "And I need surveillance footage from the last hour." Black sedan. No plates. Another pause. Then a sigh. "You think it's him?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I think Daniel wants me to know he's watching." A silence stretched between them. Then Price's tone shifted. "Eleanor, listen to me. We can still move you. It's not too late." She shook her head, already knowing her answer. "I'm not running, Price. Not now. Not ever." A long exhale on the other end. Then finally, "I'll be there in an hour." She hung up. Eleanor placed the phone down. Her fingers loosened from the gun, but she didn't put it away. Not yet. The game had changed. This wasn't just Daniel and Eleanor anymore. This was about something more. He had taken everything from her once. She wouldn't let him take this too. She wouldn't let him decide how this ended. For years, Daniel had been the hunter. Now, Eleanor Carter was ready to become the predator. The rain had started falling in slow, deliberate drops as Agent Samuel Price stepped out of the FBI field office and into the nearly deserted parking lot. The city was quiet at this hour, just before dawn, when even the criminals seemed to pause. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders, his mind still occupied with the implications of Daniel Carter's escape. Then he saw it. A single white envelope, tucked under his windshield wiper. Price stilled. His pulse remained steady, but his hand flexed instinctively toward his weapon as he approached the car. Years of working high-profile cases had trained him to notice everything, to register details before his mind had fully processed them. No other cars had similar notes. No security cameras faced his exact parking spot. Whoever had left it had chosen him specifically. He pulled the envelope free, his fingers barely wet from the raindrops sliding over the paper. Flipping it open, he saw just 3 words, handwritten in ink so dark it almost bled into the page. "See you soon." He let out a slow breath, his thumb grazing the edge of the note. There was no signature, no flourish, no indication of who had left it. But he knew. Daniel. It wasn't just a message. It was a reminder, A statement that despite the guards, the locked cells, the years of separation, Daniel was still in control of the game. Price's jaw clenched as he folded the note and slid it into his pocket. The bastard was moving faster than expected. He yanked open the car door, already reaching for his phone. Eleanor needed to know. Eleanor Carter stood at her front door, staring down at the package resting on the welcome mat. She had been expecting something. A move. A message. Some sign that Daniel was done watching and ready to start playing. But even with all her preparation, even knowing he would strike soon, something about this felt different. Her security team had already scanned it. No explosives. No toxins. Nothing inside that could physically harm her. No, Daniel's weapons weren't bombs or bullets. His weapons were psychological. Still, she wasn't careless. She slipped on a pair of gloves, crouching slowly before lifting the lid. Inside was a single photograph. For a moment her breath hitched. She had seen this photo before. Their wedding day. A snapshot from years ago, when she had still believed in the illusion. She had been wearing her mother's sapphire necklace, the same one Daniel had later stolen for his mistress. His arm had been around her waist, his smile charming, confident. They had looked perfect. But this version of the photo was wrong. Her face was slashed through with thick red ink. Jagged, violent strokes erased her eyes, her smile, her very presence. But Daniel's face? Untouched. Her fingers pressed against the edges of the paper, her grip tightening. This was no ordinary threat. This was Daniel rewriting history. In his mind she was already erased. A chill slid down her spine, but she forced it away, inhaling steadily. He wanted her to react. To be unnerved. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead she stood carrying the package inside. She placed it on the kitchen counter, next to a stack of case files on medical corruption she had been reviewing for weeks. The past and present colliding. Her phone rang, cutting through the silence. She didn't have to check the screen to know it was Price. "You got something?" she asked as she answered. A pause. Then his voice steady but edged. "He left me a note." A flicker of something sharp and dark moved through her, but her tone remained cool. "What did it say?" "See you soon." Her fingers tapped against the counter, her mind already connecting the dots. First the surveillance outside her home, then the package. Now Price receiving a direct message. Daniel wasn't just watching her anymore. He was expanding his reach. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about control. Price exhaled into the receiver. "I don't like this, Eleanor." "Neither do I," she admitted. A pause. Then quieter. "What did he send you?" She glanced at the ruined photograph, the streaks of red still glaring beneath the light. "A reminder," she murmured, "that I was never supposed to survive him." Silence stretched between them. Then Price's voice hardened. "He's escalating." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know." She reached for the photo once more, studying the way her absence had been carved into it. Daniel wanted her to believe she had no place left in the world, that she was a ghost walking in a life that didn't belong to her, that he would be the one to finish what he started. She let out a breath. He was wrong. The last time she had been blindsided. This time she was ready. "You need to be careful," Price said. A small, sharp smile touched her lips. He should be the one worried. She hung up, tossing the photograph back into the box. Then she grabbed her laptop, opening a secured file. Surveillance footage. Financial records. Prison logs. She had spent years preparing for Daniel's return. She knew his patterns, his old contacts, the people who might have helped him disappear. He was hunting her, but he had made one fatal mistake. He had let her see him coming. She clicked open a folder labeled Carter, Contingency Plan. It was time to set the trap. The night felt longer than usual, stretching endlessly as Eleanor sat in her dimly lit study. A cup of untouched tea rested beside her, the steam long since faded. She hadn't slept in days, not truly. Not since the first sign that Daniel had found his way inside. It had started with small things, barely noticeable, but enough to tell her she wasn't alone. A chair in her kitchen slightly out of place. Her closet door left ajar when she was certain she had closed it. The scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway when no one had been there but her. She had reset the security system twice. No alarms had gone off. No cameras had caught an intruder. But Eleanor knew better. Daniel had been inside her home. She stared at the array of documents spread across her desk, each one part of a carefully constructed plan to track his movements. But tracking a ghost was harder than she expected. A creak from the hallway made her turn sharply. Nothing. She inhaled, slow and measured, before pushing her chair back and walking toward her bedroom. She kept a gun within reach at all times now, but it wasn't the weapon she relied on. Her mind was the sharpest blade she had. She had outmaneuvered Daniel before. She would do it again. Eleanor had anticipated a message from Daniel, but she hadn't expected it to arrive so soon, or so personal. The package came in the morning, unmarked, left at her doorstep despite the constant security patrols. Her team checked it for explosives and toxins. Nothing dangerous, except for what it meant. She opened the box carefully, her fingers steady despite the slow rise of unease pressing against her ribs. Inside, wrapped delicately in white tissue paper, was a baby blanket. Soft, new, unused, but embroidered on the front, stitched with perfect precision, were 4 chilling words. A father should know his child. Eleanor's breath came slow and even, her eyes unmoving as she stared at the fabric. He knew. He knew about the pregnancy, and that changed everything. Her stomach tightened, her fingers pressing against the edge of the blanket. She had only recently accepted the truth herself, hadn't told anyone except her doctor and Price, which meant Daniel had been watching her more closely than she realized. Her security team exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for her reaction. She said nothing, simply closed the lid and handed the box to one of the agents. "Dust it for prints," she ordered, her voice cold. "And I want a full report on how it got here." She turned and walked inside, shutting the door behind her before anyone could see the way her hands trembled. That night, Eleanor felt him in the walls. Not physically. Not yet. But his presence was suffocating, woven into the air, into the fabric of her home. This was what he did. He dismantled sanity piece by piece, fraying the edges until control no longer existed. She walked through the house methodically, checking every room. The locks were engaged, the windows secured, the alarm system active. Yet, when she stepped into her closet, a dress had been pulled from its hanger. A simple blue dress, one Daniel had once told her was his favorite. It had been placed on the chair in the corner, folded neatly, waiting. A silent demand. Eleanor reached forward, her fingers brushing the fabric. She refused to let fear win. Instead, she carried the dress downstairs, walked straight to the fireplace, and tossed it into the flames. The fabric curled, blackened, burned. She stood there until nothing remained. Daniel wanted her to react, but she would not play by his rules. The next message arrived in the form of a photograph, slipped under her bedroom door in the middle of the night. Security footage showed no movement, no breach, but the photo was there when she woke up. It was an image from years ago, a moment she had long forgotten, her and Daniel on vacation in Paris, standing near the Seine, wine glasses in hand, laughter frozen in time. But just like the last picture he had sent, this one had been altered. Her face was removed, cut out with surgical precision. His remained untouched. A silent message. She was already gone in his mind. Eleanor let the photo fall from her fingers onto the desk. Daniel was doing what he did best, twisting the past, rewriting their story. But what he didn't realize was that she was writing the ending this time, and it would be his final chapter. Eleanor knew she couldn't simply run. She wouldn't. Daniel expected fear, expected retreat. Instead, she prepared. She expanded her security network, pulling in former intelligence operatives, people who specialized in tracking ghosts like Daniel. She tapped into every resource she had built over the years, making sure that when Daniel made his next move, she would be ready. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was hunting him back. And when she found him, she wouldn't hesitate, because now this fight wasn't just hers. Now she had a life inside her to protect. A child that would never know the monster who created it. A child that would never have to live in his shadow. Eleanor Carter had destroyed Daniel once. This time she would erase him completely. Eleanor Carter refused to be prey. She had spent too many years rebuilding her life, strengthening her mind, and fortifying her defenses to let Daniel Carter undo it all. He had expected her to run, to hide, to cower in fear like she had years ago when she first learned the truth about him. But he had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated her. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was preparing. Eleanor wasted no time in fortifying her security. She relocated to a new undisclosed residence, one with triple-layered security, infrared surveillance, and a rotating team of armed guards. No more predictable patterns, no more vulnerabilities Daniel could exploit. She personally vetted every member of her security detail, trusting no one blindly. These weren't standard bodyguards. They were former intelligence operatives, cyber warfare experts, and tactical specialists, people who understood how to hunt and neutralize threats before they even reached the front door. Price helped coordinate the logistics, securing government surveillance assistance and implementing advanced tracking measures on all financial transactions, known associates, and communication trails linked to Daniel. But Eleanor knew that defense alone wasn't enough. Daniel had to be eliminated. And to do that, she had to get inside his head. She spent hours dissecting every file, every interview, every note taken during his psychological evaluations. She pored over transcripts from his time in prison, reports from inmates and guards, analyzing every detail. Patterns emerged. Daniel had never accepted losing control. He had never truly broken inside that prison cell, because he had spent every moment planning his return. His mind worked in cycles, predictable only in its arrogance. His ego had always been his greatest weakness. If she could make him believe that he was still the one controlling the game, she could lure him into a trap. Eleanor dug deeper than ever before, searching for anyone from Daniel's past who might still be useful to her. She found Dr. Nathan Bellamy, a former colleague of Daniel's, now disgraced and under investigation for fraud. Years ago, Bellamy had been one of Daniel's closest confidants, a man who had admired his talent even as he ignored his crimes. Eleanor arranged a quiet meeting, using Price's resources to ensure Bellamy had no choice but to cooperate. The man arrived at a secure location, a luxury hotel suite that had been rented under a false identity. He was sweating when he entered. "You want information on Carter?" Bellamy said, his voice tight with nerves. "I don't know where he is. He hasn't reached out to me. I swear." Eleanor leaned forward, her calmness a stark contrast to his unease. "I don't need you to tell me where he is, Dr. Bellamy." Her voice was smooth, deliberate. "I need you to tell me how to break him." Bellamy hesitated, then exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Daniel Carter doesn't break." Eleanor's lips curled slightly. "Everyone breaks, Doctor. It's just a matter of finding the right pressure point." It took hours, but Bellamy finally gave her what she needed. Daniel's greatest secret, the one thing that had haunted him long before his crimes were exposed. His mother. No one ever talked about Margaret Carter, the woman who had raised Daniel in near isolation, molding him into the brilliant, twisted man he became. Eleanor found old records, medical reports, psychiatric evaluations. Margaret had been obsessed with perfection, demanding absolute control over every aspect of Daniel's life. She had micromanaged his childhood, crushed his emotions, and drilled into him the idea that failure was a sin worse than death. When she had died, Daniel had not spoken of her once. Eleanor finally understood. He had never wanted a wife. He had wanted a woman who worshipped him, who validated his perfection. And when she refused, when she defied him, he had tried to erase her. Now Eleanor had something she could use against him, a wound he had never allowed to heal. Eleanor had Price leak false information through carefully placed channels, whispers in the criminal underworld, quiet mentions in financial circles. The story? That she was cracking under the pressure, that she was on the verge of a breakdown, that she was considering going public about the pregnancy. It wouldn't take long for that information to reach Daniel, and when it did, he would come for her, not as a shadow in the night, not as a whisper in the dark, but directly. She had set the pieces in motion. Now she only had to wait. Daniel had underestimated her before. This time it would be his final mistake. The war had begun. For weeks, Eleanor and Daniel had been circling each other in the shadows, each move calculated, each step deliberate. They were no longer merely adversaries. They were two predators, locked in a battle where only one would survive. Daniel wasn't just hunting her. He was playing his old game, psychological destruction before the kill. He wanted to shatter her mind before he took her life, to make her doubt herself, to strip away the power she had rebuilt. But Eleanor wasn't the same woman he had once manipulated. She had spent years preparing for this moment, sharpening herself into something stronger, colder, and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. She had let him believe that he was still in control, that she was reacting to him, but in reality, she had been setting the pieces in place for the final trap. It was only a matter of time before one of them made the final move. The threats became bolder. Eleanor woke one morning to find a blood-red X painted on her bedroom mirror. Security footage showed nothing, as though Daniel had slipped through the walls unseen. A baby doll, dressed in white, was left on her doorstep. Its head had been twisted backward, a chilling mockery of what he imagined was her impending motherhood. Then the most personal attack yet. Her mother's grave was desecrated, the headstone shattered. The flowers she had placed last week burned to ash. A single note had been left behind, nailed into the stone. "You can't protect what's already doomed." Eleanor did not cry. She did not rage. She simply called Agent Price and gave him the order. "We end this. Now." For the first time, Eleanor didn't wait for Daniel to strike. Using the leads she had gathered, she traced his movements through the underground networks, pinpointing his most probable safe house. A rundown apartment in an abandoned building, one of his old hiding places. She had spent years studying his patterns, knowing that his ego wouldn't let him hide forever. He would want to stay close enough to watch her, to control the narrative. So she set her own plan in motion. She leaked false information, letting word spread that she was going into hiding, that she was afraid, that she was preparing to run with the child before he could reach her. She knew exactly how Daniel would respond, and he did. He took the bait. Eleanor arrived at the abandoned apartment, her heart steady, her grip firm on the gun concealed beneath her coat. Price's team was stationed nearby, ready to move at her signal, but she had insisted on going in first. She had to face him alone. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and decay. The walls were peeling, the furniture long abandoned. But the space was not empty. Daniel was waiting. He stood near the window, his silhouette tall and unbothered, his lips curling in amusement as she stepped inside. "Eleanor." His voice was smooth, pleased. "Finally. You came." She didn't answer, closing the door behind her with calm precision. For a moment they simply stared at each other. Two people who had once shared a life. Two people who had now become each other's inevitable executioners. Daniel studied her, his sharp eyes flicking to her stomach, a slow smirk spreading. "I always knew you'd carry a part of me." His voice was soft, almost mocking. Fate has a sense of humor, doesn't it? Eleanor's expression did not waver. "You don't have control over this, Daniel." He laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, but I do. You wouldn't be here otherwise. You wouldn't have spent weeks thinking about me, dreaming about how to stop me." She exhaled, tilting her head. "You know what I've realized? You're predictable." That made him pause. Her voice remained calm, sharp like a blade. "You spent years convincing yourself you were untouchable, that you were always 5 steps ahead of everyone else. But here's the truth, you're stuck in your own pattern. And I broke out of mine a long time ago." His smirk faltered, and then she pulled out her gun. Daniel's smirk vanished. He had expected her to argue, to plead, to hesitate. But Eleanor did not hesitate. She fired. The first bullet tore through his shoulder, sending him staggering backward against the wall. He clutched the wound, eyes wild with something he had never truly experienced, shock. Eleanor took a step forward, her gun still raised. "This ends tonight." The door burst open as Price and his team rushed in, guns drawn. Daniel tried to move, to run, to fight, but there was nowhere left to go. This time there were no shadows to disappear into. No escape. As he was pinned to the ground, his gaze met Eleanor's one final time. Something flickered in his eyes. Not fear but realization. He had lost. Eleanor exhaled, her grip on the gun finally easing. It was over. For good. The news broke the next morning. Daniel Carter, captured in a federal sting operation, linked to multiple ongoing crimes. Eleanor watched the headlines without emotion. Her battle was over, but her war had just begun. She had a child to protect, a future to reclaim, and she would never let fear rule her life again. In 2025, this story of resilience, power, and psychological warfare resonates more than ever. As we navigate a world increasingly shaped by technology, surveillance, and personal security threats, Eleanor Carter's journey serves as a reminder of the importance of control, preparation, and adaptation. Her battle against Daniel Carter is not just about revenge or justice. It is about reclaiming power over one's own life, refusing to be a victim, and understanding that sometimes survival requires playing the long game. One of the most striking lessons from this story is the role of psychological manipulation in power dynamics. Daniel never relied solely on physical violence. His true weapon was control through fear and perception. This is a crucial takeaway for 2025, an era where digital threats, cyber attacks, and emotional manipulation through media and misinformation have become as dangerous as physical confrontations. Learning to recognize manipulation tactics, gaslighting, and calculated intimidation can be a vital skill, whether in personal relationships, professional environments, or even global politics. Eleanor's transformation also highlights the importance of preparation and intelligence gathering. She does not wait to be a victim. She educates herself, strengthens her defenses, and anticipates her enemies' moves. In today's world, this mindset is essential. Whether dealing with corporate espionage, online security breaches, or personal safety concerns, knowledge and strategy are the greatest assets. Her journey encourages critical thinking, self-reliance, and emotional discipline, qualities that are indispensable in a rapidly evolving society. Furthermore, the story challenges the traditional narrative of victimhood. Eleanor refuses to let her past define her, choosing instead to take charge of her own destiny. In 2025, as conversations around trauma recovery, female empowerment, and personal agency continue to gain momentum, her story serves as an inspiration to those who have faced abuse, betrayal, or hardship. It reminds us that while scars may remain, they do not have to dictate the future. Ultimately, this story is a testament to the power of resilience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. It teaches us that the past may shape us, but it does not have to control us. In a world where threats, both seen and unseen, exist in many forms, the ability to adapt, outthink, and reclaim one's power is more critical than ever. Eleanor Carter has fought harder than anyone could imagine. She has been stalked, tormented, and hunted by the man who once claimed to love her. A man who turned out to be a monster lurking behind a surgeon's mask. Yet, despite everything, she did not break. She refused to run when the world expected her to. She faced her greatest fear, not just for herself, but for the child growing inside her. But now the question remains, what should Eleanor do next? We've seen her outmaneuver Daniel Carter at every turn. We've seen her transform from the hunted to the hunter, the survivor to the warrior. But does the war truly end here? Daniel has been captured, but will the system hold him this time? Or will the cycle of manipulation and escape begin again? Has Eleanor done enough to ensure that Daniel can never return? Should she push for his complete legal and psychological destruction, dismantling his remaining influence so that he is permanently erased from society? Should she expose every hidden accomplice, every shadowy supporter who helped him survive in the dark? Should she use her own trauma to create something greater? Advocacy for victims of psychological abuse, support for those who have faced manipulation like hers? And what about the child? Her child will never know Daniel Carter as a father, but will they one day ask about him? Should Eleanor keep her past buried and move forward? Or should she own her truth and ensure her child understands the strength that brought them into the world? Now we turn to you, the audience. What would you do in Eleanor's place? If you were in her shoes, carrying the weight of survival, revenge, and an uncertain future, what path would you take? Leave your thoughts below. Should Eleanor seek justice, vengeance, or complete freedom? How can she ensure that Daniel Carter's shadow never looms over her life again? The story isn't over yet, and your voice could shape Eleanor's next move.